I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. Jeff, it's a real pleasure to have you this afternoon. We've had a really great 2.5 days or so. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and really excited to have you this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure to work with you and our good pal, Therese. So I am happy to be here, and I'm happy to talk about presidential decision making. Now, the title of my talk had something to do with Plinko, presidential, here it is, like an ascending Plinko chip, presidential decision making in the Roosevelt era. Now, we've all seen Plinko, right? And we know the basic idea is you start up here, and the hope is to get down here to the number 5. That's where the big points are. But we know as we do this, things end up in kinds of strange places. So if I go straight down here, I end up at 3. If I drop this over here, let's say I start on that side, I drop down to 1. If I start way over here, still 1, right? So I'm not ending up where it is that I want to be. And my contention with this presentation is that presidential decision making is a lot like that. You start off thinking you want to be someplace, and then what happens is as you begin to go through the process, your decision making, your idea, the thing that you're trying to bring about as a solution begins to bump up against all these little pins, and it gets bounced around, knocked around to different places. And where you end up is not necessarily where you want to begin. So let's see a little bit how this worked in FDR's time. Now, FDR probably made more decisions than any other president. And I say that simply because he was president for 12 years, right? Longer than anybody ever has been president or ever will be. He was president, of course, during the 2 greatest crises of the 20th century, first the Great Depression, then the Second World War. And he helped to lay out many of the decisions that helped to shape the post-war period. Now, certainly Harry Truman, who comes in, right after FDR, the first 4 months of his term are probably 4 of the most tumultuous times in certainly American history, possibly world history. But FDR had those 2 great crises that he had to get us through. So let's take a look first at who FDR was, and then we're going to get into some things that need to be considered and thought about while we're making decisions. I have a rubric that I have not yet shared with Therese, but I'll get that to you guys so you can work with this with your students or at home or however you want to do this. So first of all, FDR loved being president. Burdens and all, who wants to be president during a Great Depression? Who wants to be president during a world war? Who wants to have to stand up to Hitler? Probably nobody except maybe FDR. He really, really loved to be president. He was able to compartmentalize his mind so that rather than being overwhelmed by a Great Depression or overwhelmed by a world war, he was able to put that aside. And every day at 5 o'clock, he would have what's called children's hour, which was basically a happy hour. And he would invite friends and associates in, and they would talk basically gossip, either office gossip or Hollywood gossip. No discussion of policy or politics during that time frame. And that gave his mind time to rest. Also, the polio helped him because he was immobilized, right? So he didn't get up and move around and walk around. So once he got settled and once he got comfortable, he tended to stay there, and he was able to focus for great periods of time. FDR was confident. He believed in himself. He believed in his ability to do things. He believed in his ability to get the people around him to do things. And he was pretty certain about who he was and what it was that he wanted to do. So this plays into the theme for the conference, which is this idea of presidential character, presidential decision making. We have a guy that loves being president. We have a guy that's confident in himself and in the job. FDR was also what I like to call a futurist. He was always thinking of the future. You can't go more than a couple of 100 pages looking at our documents without seeing some reference to our children, our children's children, generations from now, the generations that follow us, 100 years from now. He's constantly making these references to the future because that's where he's looking. Now, he was no Pollyanna. Right? He understood, when we get to, and it's in the Great Depression, he understands there's 25% unemployment, 25% underemployment. He understands the suicide rate has tripled. He understands there's 1,000 banks going under every month, but he doesn't let it cripple him in what he's able to do and the kinds of future that he wants to envision. So he and Eleanor Roosevelt are always looking to the future. Okay, here's where we are. These are the rotten conditions that we're in, but that's where I want to be. I want to be at a place where there's better employment. I want to be at a place where there's better housing. I want to be in a place where there's a stable, banking and economic system. I want to be in a place where there's a peaceful world. And then what he would do, and Eleanor would do as well, is they would build the pathways to get from where they were to where it was that they wanted to be. So although he was a futurist, he was also really a realist as well. Now, when it comes to presidential decision making, not all of FDR's decisions were good ones. Okay, and that's one of the things I think if you are working with the presidential libraries, one of the things I think you'll find very refreshing is that, each of the presidential libraries kind of admit the president's mistakes, right? None of these guys were perfect. So we try to present them warts and all. So not all of his decisions were good ones. Maybe not all of his decisions were defensible. If you want to take a look at some of the decisions he made and say, well, he really shouldn't have done that. He really, should have done this. He really shouldn't have done that. He really should have done this other thing. But I think one thing that is certain is all of his decisions are explainable, right? You can explain them to folks. And that's one of the things that we do around here all the time. When we talk about Japanese American internment, when we talk about, why didn't he start the refugee board, in 41 as opposed to 43? Why didn't he sign the anti-lynching bill? These are all decisions that the president made that if they are not defensible, they certainly are explainable. And we're going to do that and present you with this sort of concept that you can then work with on presidential decisions. Now, without the rubric that I'm going to present to you, it's easy to say, well, he was right about this, or he's wrong about that, or that was good, or that was bad, or that helped, or that hurt. But by looking at this rubric that I'm going to show you, what you begin to get is a sense of how complex these presidential decisions actually are. I'm going to do this old school and just sort of hold this up to the screen. I know you probably can't read that too well, but this is the rubric I'm going to use. I'm going to walk you through this, and then I'll make this available so you can use it in class and such. So that's how we're going to go about this. So the first thing is the characteristics of the decision maker. So you're looking at presidential, decisions. Who is making this decision? Who is that president? And there's a couple of things we need to consider. Is this person who's making this decision a big thinker or a small thinker? Right? Are they thinking big or are they thinking small? And FDR was a big thinker. When you think about his administration, you're talking about things like the New Deal, Lend-Lease, the atomic bomb, 4 freedoms, the United Nations, being president for 4 terms. These are big concepts that he's willing and I would say able to take on, and so he's able to do that. And he got this this sense of being a big thinker from the Roosevelt side of his family. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was one of his heroes, one of his idols. And shortly after FDR got out of college, he went to Panama to visit the Panama Canal zone, which was currently under construction. And he was amazed. He saw boulders the size of houses. He saw machines the size of houses. He saw houses the size of houses. And he couldn't believe that they were digging this ditch right through the middle of 2 continents. And yet it was Teddy Roosevelt who was taking a lead on a lot of this. And this sort of gave FDR that permission to think big. And that stayed with him for the rest of his life. So is the decision maker a big thinker or are they a small thinker? The next is in terms of characteristics of the decision maker, are they confident or are they timid? right? Are they leaning into this, or are they kind of being dragged into it? And FDR was very confident. You know, it always amazes me that in the throes of the Great Depression, you know, 25% unemployment, 25% underemployment, third of the, the suicide rate going up, 3 times, banks failing, farms failing, that he steps in front of us and the first words he says to this country is that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he gets this confidence from the Delano side of his family. The Delanos were a seafaring family, and they made and lost several fortunes over the course of several generations. And every time they lost a fortune, they just dusted themselves off, got back in it, and continued on. And lo and behold, shortly thereafter, they would create another fortune. And that's exactly the way Franklin Roosevelt viewed things. You know, he went to bed one night with a backache. He woke up the next day, he was unable to move. And people don't realize that, but he was unable to move. He couldn't even lift a soup spoon. Eventually it settled in his legs, the polio, and he regained his upper body strength, but it didn't stop him, right? He was going to continue to go on. Is the decision maker taking a long view or a short view? And this is really important, I think, with politicians today, because most politicians are thinking, you know, what's the next news cycle going to be in the short run? And then what's the next election cycle going to be? Very rarely do you get these guys that are looking at, 100 years from now, 20 years from now, long view types of folks. And as I said, FDR was a futurist, always looking for down the line, our children, our children's children. So is he a big thinker or a small thinker? Is he competent or is he timid? Does he take a long-term view or a short-term view? And then another thing we need to consider is, does this president or does this decision maker work within the framework of existing norms and structures, or does he create new ones? And this is something that Franklin Roosevelt did. He created new structures. The government grew under Franklin Roosevelt. He took power from the Constitution that he believed he could take, but that might not necessarily have been granted to him in the Constitution or used by other presidents along the way. He got the economy going again by creating 44 federal programs, right? Unheard of in American history. And he began to expand his government powers. He did a government reorganization, which allowed more power to come into the executive branch. He decides he's going to run for a 3rd term and then decides to run for a 4th term. So what he's doing is he is stretching the norms, he's stretching the mechanisms, the framework of what is already there. If you've got a decision maker that's willing to do that, more things are possible. And then finally, we have to think, does this decision maker own the decision, or do they deflect the decision? Do they embrace what they've made, the decision that they've made, and do they stand behind it? Or is it something where they say, well, here's the reason why, we can't do this, or here's the reason why that's not going to work, or here's the reason why I'm not going to go forward with this. Does that person stand up and own that particular thing? So on the rubric, I'll share with you guys, we've got this idea of characteristics of the decision maker: big and small thinker, confident and timid, long-term, short-term, within the framework or create new framework, and do they own or deflect? So that's the characteristic parts. Then we have the decision style. The decision style. And what is the style that this person uses to make these decisions? Is it an active decision or is it a passive decision? Is it something where they go in there and they say, I want to tackle that problem? Or do they kind of say, oh, well, let's just not deal with this until the problem actually, really boils over and really comes, to fruition? Some presidents will just do that. They'll ignore something, hoping it goes away, hoping somebody else will take care of it. Franklin Roosevelt tended not to do that. He got in there, and in the first 100 days in office, he creates 16 major pieces of legislation, which gets the government moving again. So President Roosevelt liked to be very active in his decision making. The second part of decision making style is, are the decisions broad and sweeping, or are they incremental? Okay, and this takes place kind of on a spectrum. Okay, so do we really want to go from 0 to 1,000, or do we want to go from 0 to 10? And Roosevelt, always looking toward the the future, always looking down the line, he always had that 1,000 in his target zone, but he understood that sometimes it could only be incrementally brought about. That's how Social Security was brought about. Social Security originally included healthcare as part of Social Security. And they had to trade that away, saying, well, let's get something passed. We'll get this started, then we'll come back and we'll incrementalize this on later on. Same thing with, let's say, race relations, right? He could very easily have desegregated the military, right? He's commander-in-chief, he could do that. And in fact, Harry Truman does that after he becomes president. But Roosevelt says, well, you know what? That's a little too far for right now. It's a bridge too far. Let's incrementalize it. I will desegregate the defense industries. That is a big step forward for people of color. It's not where they want to be. It's not where they ought to be, but that's the best we can do at this time. Same thing with some of the refugee issues, later on. There was not a big public outcry to bring in refugees into the country, in 1941, the way there was, let's say, in 1943. So incremental. Is the decision maker a quick decision maker, or are they deliberative? And FDR liked action. He liked to think things through, and then he liked to make it happen. And so he was very action-y that way. And then finally, do they make these decisions independently, or are they consensus builders? Now, one of the things about Franklin Roosevelt is he had a very small, tight-knit group of advisors. He had one group for the Great Depression and the New Deal, and another group really for World War II. There was some overlap in that. Eleanor was one of the people there. But basically, he had a very small, tight-knit group of people that he would bounce ideas off of, and then he would make the ultimate decision. So he was not really a consensus builder so much as he was an independent decision maker and an independent thinker in terms of what he wanted to do. Throw ideas out, but only to a small group of people. So the first two parts of this decision making and style and all this really depend upon who the president is. What is their character like? What is their decision making style? And that becomes a big variable depending upon who it is that you're talking about. But then there's another thing that comes into play, which is presidential power sources. Okay, what is the source of presidential power? And basically, there are four main sources of presidential power. These are command power, persuasion power, ideological power, and bargaining power. Okay, so every president that comes in to be president, right? You've got four categories of power. You've got command power, you've got persuasive power, you've got ideological power, and you've got bargaining power. Now, let's say we assign 25% to each of those four categories of power, adding up to 100% of presidential power. Each individual president doesn't necessarily have that at any given moment. And let me define what these things are so we're all talking kind of from the same page here. Command power is probably the most absolute power the president has. That comes directly from the Constitution, it comes to the president by law, or it comes to the president by political tradition. So no matter who you are, you've got the Constitution backing you up. Hey, I'm commander-in-chief. I can do this. I can appoint, ambassadors. How come it says that? Because the Constitution says it. That's what I can do. That is command power. And most people, especially students, think, well, if the president's so powerful, why doesn't he just do this or do that or do this or do that? Because that power is a variable. The first is command power, 25%. The second type of power or category of power is this idea of persuasion. And let's again say we got 25% of that. Now, what persuasive power is the ability of the president to convince others to do what it is that he wants them to do. Okay, so how persuasive is a president, right? Are they able to get you to do what it is that you, is he able to get somebody else to do what it is that he wants them to do? How well can he convince people? And this is going to depend upon that president's credibility. It's going to depend upon the trust that people have in the president. It's going to depend upon the president's likability. And it's going to depend upon the president's ability to communicate. So how well is this person able to persuade people? And, you know, if you get up there and people don't trust you, right? Like you take a guy like, you know, and I'm not picking on presidents, I'm not picking on any particular president, but let's take a look at some of these styles, right? So, you know, would you trust Richard Nixon in the summer of 1973? Probably not, right? His persuasive power was really beginning to get down there because of the Watergate scandal. You know, President Roosevelt, as part of this persuasive power, was able to use his fireside chats through communication, and he laid out a very simple formula in his fireside chats. There was a three-part formula. The first thing is tell what the problem is. The second thing is tell what his solution was going to be. And the third thing was to ask people to contribute to that solution. I want to talk to you tonight about banking. Here's the problem with the banks. They're unstable. I'm going to shut them down for a bank holiday for 1 week. What I want you to do at the end of that week is to put your money back in the bank. When you're able to be someone that can communicate that well and boil down the whole big banking crisis into a three-part little formula like that, you're able to communicate that. And what ends up happening is you become very persuasive that way. The third power, is ideological power. And what this comes down to is, do people value your values? Okay, do the people value your values? And these could be the people in the United States. It could be the people in Congress. It could be the people in media. What kind of ideological power are you able to exercise? Do people value your values? Do you have strong party support? You take a look at somebody like, let's say, a Jimmy Carter, right, who comes into power and he almost immediately begins to, alienate some of the key Democrats in his own party. So they don't really look at him as the leader. You know, it's like he's a leader, but he's not the leader. You look at a guy like Ronald Reagan, comes in 1980. Here's this guy, right, this big wave coming in here. He looks like a president. He acts like a president. You know, he's got that command. Ideologically, he's this conservative. People are swept up in that, and he's got a lot of ideological power that he's able to work with. Very often, what will happen is in a time of crisis, you know, a war, a natural disaster, something like that, people will rally behind the president, right? Because they, you know, again, this idea is people that value your values. So hopefully you think the president is trying to do something to solve that crisis. So your ideological power can go up a little bit that way as well. This is also dependent upon how did you become president, right? Was it a landslide, or did you just barely eke by and get in? All right, if it's a landslide, you're going to have a lot of ideological power because you're able to say to people, hey, you know, I just got this huge election because most of you believe in what we're trying to do here, and that carries and sweeps people along. The fourth category or source of power is this idea of bargaining power. All right, how well is that particular president able to bargain? And your ability to bargain, your ability to horse trade, again, depends upon your ability to communicate. It depends upon your trustworthiness. It depends upon your credibility. And it also depends upon where you are in your term. All right, if you're in the first couple of months of your term, you know, you are in a much better position to bargain because you say, well, you know what, I want you guys to work with me. Mark Adams, I want you to work with me on this. And if you don't, you know, if you want to go against me right now, I'm going to be in office for the next 4 years. So if you want access to what I have as president, if you want access to the White House, if you want access to, me coming and campaigning for you or whatever, then I'm going to need something from you. So it's this bargaining power that the president has. In the final weeks of their, months, the final year of their administration, the bargaining power begins to dwindle. Right? As people look on to who the next candidate is going to be, the ideological power may begin to dwindle. This is one of the criticisms of the 22nd Amendment, because the minute the president gets reelected to a second term, the clock is ticking. And you know that 4 years from then, that president is going to be out of office. President Roosevelt, who was president for 3 terms and then 83 days of the 4th term, you never knew when this guy was going to leave office. So am I going to have to deal with this guy for 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, 16 years? That's a lot of power that comes into that. So a president comes to office and they basically got 4 categories of power. They've got the command power that comes directly from the Constitution. They've got persuasive power. How well are they able to get other people to do what it is they want them to do? They've got ideological power. How well do people value that president's values and therefore want to be part of that team? And then the bargaining power. What is the horse trading back and forth that you have in political systems? And if you take a look at that as those 4 categories, what you're going to find is that 75% of that power is a variable. 25% command is a given. The rest is going to depend upon that president and their ability to make decisions and their ability to, to show what their character is all about. So that's another category in our rubric. And then the final thing is the checks to power. Okay, so everybody's, oh, the president's so powerful, but his power is actually quite checked and quite limited. And we'll take a look at some of those. The first is the Constitution, right? You say, wait a minute, wasn't the Constitution a source of power? Yes, but it's also a check on the president's power. Okay, it's also, the president, unless they're an activist president, unless they're trying to create the mechanisms, they will tend to be constrained by what the Constitution says you can do or can't do. 22nd Amendment, it's, great example, right? President Roosevelt could not be president for a 3rd term if the 22nd Amendment had existed at that point in time. Another check to your power are the laws that are passed, right? And we see this with FDR in terms of things like immigration, in terms of things like the neutrality laws, right? People say, well, why didn't he, why did he have to create lend-lease? Why couldn't he just give this stuff? Why couldn't he just sell this stuff? Well, because there were neutrality laws that were passed that he wasn't able to get around, by passing new legislation. So he was limited by the laws that were there. Sometimes you're limited by your own party. And FDR had this problem as well. He was the head of the Democrats, certainly, right? And he certainly was, the ideological leader of the New Deal and all that. But the Southern Dixiecrats, right, the Southern Democrats in the Congress, and yes, it was a Democratic Congress, but that Democratic Congress was dominated due to the seniority system by senior members in committees, senior members, in various agencies and such were tended to be Southern Democrats. And so when President Roosevelt wanted to advance things like civil rights, when President Roosevelt wanted to move forward on that, he was limited in that because he knew that if he threw his support behind a federal anti-lynching law, then that would mean he would lose the support of those Southern Democrats for anything else that it was that he wanted to do. So it's easy to sit here and say, well, why didn't he just, pass an anti-lynching bill? Why didn't he, put that through Congress? Why didn't he push for that? Well, because it was a political trade-off, right? It was a check that was on his power that way. You also have to deal with the media. Right, that is a check on your power because there is spin, there is misinformation, there are lies at the very worst. And at the very worst, the other side is saying lies about you, making things up, saying things that are not true. But you also may have a communication problem, right? Remember Jimmy Carter gets out there in the summer of 1979 and he gives what's called the malaise speech. Right, and he goes away for 40 days and he does all this soul searching and then he comes back and he says what's wrong with the country, right? And the country said, well, what do you mean? You went away for 40 days, now you're blaming us for everything? You're the president, you solved this stuff. And what the President Carter was trying to do was not blame people. He was trying to identify the problem, but it didn't come off that way, right? The communication was miscommunicated. One of the things that people are saying right now about the current administration is they need to do a better job with their messaging, right? So the media will play into that. Public opinion, also very important as a check. And this can go both ways. And I'll show you that with the Roosevelt example. Japanese American internment, right? Japanese American incarceration, Executive Order 9066 was a very popular executive order when President Roosevelt put that out. In fact, it was upheld by 2 Supreme Court cases. And clearly that was not a good law, right? This was not a good executive order, but the popular opinion at the time backed it up. So sometimes public opinion can be wrong. Sometimes public opinion goes against you. I think of Gerald Ford with the Nixon pardon, right? You know, that was probably the right thing to do, right? Move the country beyond Watergate, get on with what we had to get on with. And yet a lot of people, you know, said, oh, that guy, he should have done that, you know, that sort of thing. So public opinion can also play into this. You also have other world powers that are checks on your power, right? So you may have allies and you may have adversaries. In fact, you will have allies and adversaries. And sometimes your allies can be problematic, right? Roosevelt saw this during the Second World War. Winston Churchill wanted to preserve the British Empire. Roosevelt said, no, we're not going to preserve a British Empire. We're going to defeat the Nazis and create democracies. Joseph Stalin wanted to start a second front right away to relieve pressure on his front that Hitler had begun to attack. And he was, you know, giving Roosevelt and Churchill a hard time about that. And, you know, Roosevelt had to balance that. He had to work that out with him. Germany and Japan, certainly, right? They're trying to take over the world, right? We got better things to do than to fight you guys. But if you're going to try to take over the world, then it looks like that's what we're going to have to do. So your allies can limit you. They can help you. Your adversaries can limit you as well. There are also other institutions that you need to worry about. Things like the courts, and FDR certainly had to worry about that with the National Recovery Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. These were struck down by the courts. This led FDR to want to do the Judicial Reorganization Act, right, which some people call court packing, but we don't around here. It's the Judicial Reorganization Act. So the courts were working against him, at least from his perspective. There's the military, you know, that's another institution, right? And Roosevelt had problems with the military at Pearl Harbor. You know, the overarching strategy was to build up this big base at Pearl Harbor to project power into the Pacific Rim. And yet there were mistakes made in the military by both the Army and the Navy. And ultimately Roosevelt's responsible for that, right? Because he's commander in chief. But nonetheless, he wasn't out there, you know, looking at what was going on. So he allowed them to make these decisions, and come to find out, you know, some of the decisions they made weren't necessarily working so well. There are bureaucrats in the agencies that could be a problem for you. Breckinridge Long worked in the State Department, and he was the guy that interpreted the immigration quotas to the number, to the letter. And Roosevelt said, look, you know, we can be a little more, flexible with this. And he said, no, this is what the law says. This is what we're going to do. And you could say, well, why didn't Roosevelt take him out? Well, it's not that easy to do. It's not that easy to take out somebody, you know, in the government bureaucracy and in the government system that way. There are also norms and traditions that might limit the president, especially if they tend to follow them, right? President Roosevelt did not let a lot of the norms and traditions of the government get in his way. In fact, President Roosevelt was stretching that mechanism, right? And he broke a lot of the norms. He was the first person to fly to one of the National Party conventions, which was really pretty cool at the time because flight was still relatively new. He was the first person to attend a national political convention in person. Usually you had to sort of stay back and say, oh, no, don't pick me. Oh, you pick me? Okay, then I'll do it. He was the first to implement a peacetime draft, right, as he was beginning to gear up to fight in the Second World War. He was the first to win a third term and the first to run for a fourth term. And he was the first to use mass media as a means of communication. So Roosevelt broke a lot of these norms. So he didn't really let this be a check on his power, but very often presidents will allow that to be. And then also we have this idea of simple reality, right? Simple reality is a check on presidential power. And this comes in terms of things like time, right? So there might not be enough time to do what it is that you want to do. Or you could be all ready with something. Eisenhower, right? On D-Day, he's all ready to go. They're all set and it's stormy weather. And so they have a 24-hour break in the weather and he decides to go ahead with the invasion, right? So they could have, thousands of tanks and thousands of planes and millions of troops and tons of supplies, but they can't control the weather. And so you got to go when that time is right. There's also resources, right? Just the physical resources. When the United States was attacked on the morning of December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, we were ranked anywhere from 14 to 17 behind Portugal in military strength. We entered the Second World War using World War I equipment. So yes, we wanted to be the arsenal of democracy. Yes, we were going to fight on to absolute victory. There's another example. Roosevelt says in his Day of Infamy speech, we will fight on to absolute victory, right? We're 14th behind Portugal in military strength. How's that going to happen? He doesn't worry about that. He's the futurist. He understands where we are. He's going to build those pathways to get there. So sometimes just the reality of what you've got going on is a problem. And then finally, where is the president in their term, right? Term timing is very important. Are you in your first term or are you in your second term? How come nobody comes into office and suddenly issues all kinds of pardons, right? These guys always give all these pardons in the last 3 weeks of their second term. Why? Because that's when they're able to get away with that. If they were to do it earlier, they're going to get all kinds of flack, all kinds of public opinion, all kinds of problems and such that are going to come from that decision. So they have to time it just right. They have to time it to make sure that they are in where they need to be in terms of their terms. Now, our president, Franklin Roosevelt, made decisions from something as simple as the famous green light letter. This is the letter that President Roosevelt wrote to the head of the baseball commission saying, yes, go ahead and continue on with baseball, even though we've been attacked at Pearl Harbor, because baseball is the national pastime, right? He's using his public opinion to continue on with that. So everything from as simple as, should we be playing baseball, to should we go ahead and develop an atomic bomb, right? The Tube-Alloy memo. So this is the kinds of decisions presidents may have to make, from something simple like that to something very difficult like that. And depending upon what the president's characteristics are, depending upon their decision style, depending upon how well they're able to muster those sources of presidential power, it's all going to have an impact on how decisions are made and what decisions are made. So I'll make this rubric available to you. And one of the ways I like to use it with students when they come here is to pick a problem, right? So, pick a decision that has to be made, and then take a look at this rubric and begin to consider each of these things. What is the president's style? What is their character? How are they going to, how well can they operate these 4 sources of power? And what are these checks going to be? How powerful are these things going to be? Is public opinion with them, or is public opinion against them? Is the media covering them well, or is the media not covering them well? And once you begin to realize this, once you begin to put this together, what students begin to understand is that presidential decision-making is a really hard job. And Eisenhower once said, something to the effect of, when you're president, you have to make the hard decisions. All the easy ones are already settled for you. All the easy ones are already decided. You get the really, really tough ones. So presidential decision-making is based upon, the fact that the presidential power actually comes from very limited sources. There's a huge number of checks against the president. The decision-making landscape is constantly changing. It's never the same from one decision to the next decision to the next decision. And presidents generally have to weigh all of these things in when they are making decisions, and they have to attach values. How much does this count over that? How important is this? Do I have that amount of power, or do I have this amount of power? And how do I leverage this to make the decision that is going to be supportable, defendable, and implementable? So let's open it up to some questions and answers. I hope that was sort of a useful rubric for you. And again, I'll get it to Therese, and she can get it out to you guys. Questions, comments, not remarks? Do the opponents of FDR ever think or try to use his physical disability against him? Yes, they did. In fact, shortly after, when President Hoover was president, he understood that Franklin Roosevelt was likely to be the Democratic nominee for the presidency in the 32 election. So he called together a group of governors to the White House, one of them being Franklin Roosevelt. And he set it up so that there wouldn't be enough chairs in the room that these guys were waiting for. And so FDR had to stand there in his leg braces, which was very, very powerful, very painful rather. And Hoover kept, oh, we'll be down. And so he was trying to get Roosevelt to sort of sit, or to show a weakness. So thereby say, well, look, if this guy can't even stand for a meeting, how's he going to run the country? Everybody knew that Franklin Roosevelt had polio. What they didn't know was the extent that it had impacted him. And he tried to downplay that. In 1944, when he's running for the 4th term, he does a big tour of the 5 boroughs in New York City. And everybody thinks, well, this guy's getting up there. He doesn't look so good. Maybe he's going to die. Maybe he's not healthy enough to run. And what Roosevelt did was said, all right, we're going to do a 5-borough tour of New York City. And it happened to be an incredibly rainy day that day. And so what they did was they set up safe houses around in the 5 boroughs. And as the president went around, when he would get drenched and wet and cold, they'd take him into a safe house, they'd change his clothes, they'd give him a little shot of brandy, rosy up his cheeks, he'd go out and then go on to the next one. And so everybody along the way saw a nice and refreshed, vibrant, vigorous Franklin Roosevelt. So there was some attempts to try to use that against him, but he was able to turn the tables on him, quite well. How instrumental or involved was Eleanor in his decision-making? Incredibly, Amy, incredibly. Mrs. Roosevelt was really a full partner in that administration. She has in large measure not been given credit for that. 10 years ago, we did a renovation at our museum. We used to have an Eleanor Roosevelt gallery. We took that out, and when we did the renovation, we sewed Mrs. Roosevelt into the story all the way along the line. Mrs. Roosevelt was one of those key people that he bounced ideas off of. Rarely did she say, now, Franklin, I want you to do this, or Franklin, don't you dare do that. But he would judge her reactions based upon these things because he knew she was out there with people. She traveled 44,000 miles her first year as First Lady. She had her ear to the ground of what people were thinking, what people were feeling, and she was able to give that back to the president as a gauge. So she was very, very instrumental in the decisions. When FDR made his unconditional surrender statement at Casablanca, impact Japanese officials not trying for surrender terms prior to Hiroshima? Possibly. I don't know. I can't get into the mind of the Japanese folks when they were thinking that, but Roosevelt understood that the seeds of the Second World War were planted at the end of the First World War. Because of the way the First World War ended, basically, the British and the French and the Americans won, but it was kind of a stalemate. And so Hitler was able to take that resentment that was, seething in the German population, and he was able to gin that up and say, hey, don't we want to go out there and make it happen? Hey, let's go do this. And so the unconditional surrender idea was, we will decisively beat our enemy. There will be no negotiation with these guys. We are going to win. They're going to lose. That's the way it is. And that will put us in a position where we can then dictate the terms, not only of the end of the war, but dictate the terms for the beginning of the peace. Let's see. Any thoughts on the PBS series Atlantic Crossing? Stick to the history, folks. Stick to the real life history, the documents. Stick to the real stuff. I love her comment to Truman when he was about to take the oath of office. Yeah, right. So President Truman says, "Hey, is there anything I can do for you, Mrs. Roosevelt?" And she puts her arm around him and says, "Is there anything I can do for you, Harry? You're the one in trouble now, pal." Right? And think about that poor guy. Right? Here's this guy, Harry Truman, vice president for 82 days. Right? He's got to fill Franklin Roosevelt's shoes. Franklin Roosevelt was not a good sharer in terms of preparing President Truman for office, right? President Roosevelt kept a very small, tight group of advisors and an intimate circle. And Harry Truman wasn't part of that. But Harry Truman comes in, and within 4 months, we usher in the atomic age, the creation of the United Nations, the Cold War, the end of the Second World War. This guy makes some big time, heavy duty decisions in that first 4 months in office. While most of us would still be on our probationary period, this guy was setting the course for the rest of the 20th century. He and Churchill famously got along, but what was his relationship like with Joseph Stalin? Well, Roosevelt, that's a great question. Roosevelt believed that he could charm anybody. He was confident. He had this great belief in his bargaining power, in his persuasive power. And he saw old Joe, or Uncle Joe, as they called him, as kind of a tough cookie, but not so tough that the edges couldn't be rounded off of. And a lot of people criticized President Roosevelt for giving away Eastern Europe at the Yalta Conference. He didn't give Eastern Europe away. Soviets were already there, right? And so he had a choice. He could try to tell Stalin, "Hey, get back and get out of there," which Stalin was not willing to do because he had just been attacked. That Russia had just been attacked twice in 100 years from the West, right? First by Napoleon, then by the Nazis. So they wanted a buffer. They wanted a zone. So the only way to get these guys out of there would have been to fight them. So what Roosevelt did, again, being a realist, was, all right, they're here they are. If I can get these guys to buy into this concept of a United Nations, I can then begin to incrementally chip away at that. We'll get the Russians in here. We'll get them all at the same table. We'll continue this good, wartime camaraderie, and we'll create a better world that way. So his relationship with Stalin was a good one, and he was sort of buttering up Stalin and trying to rough off some of the rough edges. And if Roosevelt had survived and lived longer, I think that would have continued. But Stalin took advantage of Truman's, kind of being in the dark on everything, and, kind of began to take advantage of that and go back on some of the agreements and things that he had made with FDR. Can you discuss the process of nominating Truman for vice president, considering he and FDR didn't have a notable or close relationship, and knowing FDR was in poor health? That's a great question. What's very interesting is, in effect, Franklin Roosevelt handpicked the next two presidents, right? When he put Ike in charge of D-Day, that made Ike a hero. When he handpicked Harry Truman to be his vice president, then that became and he dies, of course, Truman becomes president. Harry Truman was selected as vice president, because Henry Wallace had gotten to be too liberal, and the country was beginning to move in a conservative way, right? So again, this check, what's the other party doing? So Harry Truman was a New Dealer, but he wasn't like a radical New Dealer like Wallace was. Harry Truman had made a great name for himself with the Truman Commission during the Second World War, exposing fraud and waste in the defense industries. Harry Truman came from the almost exact pinpoint middle of the country. So he wasn't really a Northerner, but he wasn't really a Southerner. He wasn't really from the East Coast. He wasn't really from the West Coast. So he had a great reputation. He was geographically perfectly centered. He was politically perfectly centered, and he wasn't a grandstander. He was going to be a team player. He was going to be a guy that was going to sit back there and do what he had to do as vice president. And all these things weighed in to FDR's decision on selecting Harry Truman. And thank goodness that he did, because I think Harry Truman ended up being a really Very nice guy and a good president. I saw you offer virtual programs on your website. Can you explain a little bit about what your virtual programs look like? Sure. The virtual programs generally go, class length, right? So I'll get on, I'll talk about, let's say, Pearl Harbor. I can show you documents. I can show you artifacts. I can show you photographs. I'll lay out what the main arguments are about that particular topic, and then we can open it up to Q&A from the students. We can do it together as a tag team if you like. I could do the whole thing if you like. We can talk through email or by phone ahead of time and get a sense of what it is you're particularly looking at. If you want to focus in on one thing or the other, they're all offered free of charge. I've got 3 sets downstairs today. I'm doing this from my office because the machine wasn't working downstairs. That's why I was a little bit out of breath when I first got on here. But I got 3 sets. There's one for the Great Depression, one for World War II, and then a Roosevelt sort of centric set. And I come on, I present whatever it is you're asking me to present, and we look at documents, objects, photographs, and we hit the major highlights of that, and then we open it up to Q&A. Anything else? Oh, let's see. Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, so hopefully we covered a lot of ground. I hope that didn't go too quick. I'm from New York. I've been clocked. I speak about 8,200 words a minute with gusts up to 9,000, when I get a good tailwind. So I hope, that if we've gone too quickly or said too much, let it percolate, shoot me an email, we'll chat, we'll talk. But what I wanted to do was to give you a larger framework of how presidents make decisions, some of the things that they're up against, some of the things that they have to deal with, dropping in some of the Roosevelt decisions along the way, and trying to help you to get your students to understand that it's not easy to make these decisions. You can't just say, well, he was wrong, he was right, he was wrong, he was right. There's a lot of factors that have to come into play with that, and it really gnaws at those presidents. It really, really gnaws at them, because ultimately, I think most of these guys, all these guys want to do the right thing, but every time you make somebody happy, you make somebody else unhappy, right? It's kind of like in-laws. But there you go. And the difference between in-laws and outlaws, right? Outlaws are actually wanted. So there you go. All right.
As someone who has in-laws that live in their house, yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I see lots of compliments coming in there. Really appreciate your time and all the resources. Please check out the FDR Library website. They got lots of great resources there. So thank you, Jeff. And
my pleasure.
Thank you for all the compliments there too for Jeff. So that was great. Thank you so much. And when we get the rubric, we'll just add it to the page where we have the other resources from the other speakers.
And if I could just jump in real quick, I just want to thank all of you for everything you guys have been doing in the classroom for your entire career, but especially the last 2 or 3 years. It is really, really hard. And people like Mark, people like myself, people like Therese, people like the other presenters on this, we understand that. We're here for you. Please don't feel alone. We are here to support you in the classroom each and every day. The work that you are doing is so critically important for this country. Keep up the good work, please.